Hi, everyone. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Broken Rails 1162nd New Social Environment. I'm Min, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Kenneth Tam and Christina Yang. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Kenneth Tam is an interdisciplinary artist who works across video, sculpture, installation, performance, and photography. Tam's work examines themes including the performance of masculinity, the transformative potential of ritual and expressions of intimacy within groups. Tam is an assistant professor at Rice University in Houston and is faculty at the Milton Avery Graduate School of the Arts at Bard College. And our host, Christina Yang, is an independent curator, writer, and scholar based in New York and Williamstown. She specializes in spectatorship, politics of the image, experimental genres, and feminist care. She has been a curator at the Kitchen, Queens, and Guggenheim Museums, as well as Williams College and UC Berkeley. She teaches in SVA's master's program in curatorial practice. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Christina.
Thank you so much, Min, for that beautiful introduction. I just want to say good afternoon to everybody on Zoom and welcome you, double welcome, and huge thanks to the Rail team, Chloe, Fong, Magali, everyone who's always expertly holds us in their hands for this beautiful program every day. I mean, can you believe that? 1,062 programs. Also, good afternoon to Ken. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail. We're super excited to speak a little bit about your new show at Bridget Donahue Gallery in New York City. Welcome to the gallery and congratulations on a fantastic effort and support of Kenneth's work. So before we sort of dive into hearing Ken speak about his work a little bit, I want to give a little background as to how we met. We met in 2017 during a program that I co-produced at the Guggenheim Museum called Summer of No. So this was during the first Trump presidency, and it was a sort of a venue for us to really bring artists and thinkers together and unpack issues, current issues, so to speak. This particular conversation was hosted by Kyung An, our assistant curator for Asian art, and it addressed new models of Asian masculinity in art and culture, and Ken was in conversation with the journalist and writer Kimberly Yam. So I remember being impressed by Ken's clarity of ideas, as well as his sophistication of thinking beyond binaries and identity stereotypes. Rather, his work in mostly performance video at the time aimed towards something more interesting and something other. He used investigative tools and simple prompts with groups of men of color, while also probing archival histories for what I call new and fabulous embodiments. His engagement with critical theory was clear and probing, while also accessible. So in the subsequent 8 years, both of us have moved around the country and weathered the pandemic, raised our families, and we're back for another tumultuous time in the US government. Ken has allowed me into several rehearsals and his studio practice as we continue a rich conversation around the performance of power, politics of the image, the body, and the gaze. So I'm thrilled to have this time together to celebrate with all of you his newest work. We're going to glance backwards a little bit towards the middle of the program to delve a little deeper in some of the themes and processes of his practice. And Ken, do you have any opening remarks you want to give the audience before we jump into looking at the work?
Not really. Just wanted to welcome everyone and thank you for spending your time with us this afternoon and for everyone at the Rail for organizing this. Yeah, that's it.
Great, great, thanks. Okay, so we're going to start with a very short excerpt from the 2-channel video that's part of the installation of the medallion, and then we'll go into sort of unpacking it a little bit. Thanks, Min. I'm actually not getting any sound. Is it just me?
I think it was me.
We started back. Yeah.
I'm gonna be next. Of the things happen like struggling, and all of a sudden, all what you dream of is went down. Like I put a lot of money toward my medallion, and all of a sudden, I'm nothing. I'm zero. That's frightening me. It was like nightmares, crying, depressed. I thought this is the end of the life. Like all my dreams went down.
Great. Thanks, Min. We'll go to the first slide, please. Okay, so once again, I want to give congratulations to Ken on his first Manhattan solo exhibition, and also thanks to Bridget Donahue, her director Tony, and the team there for their help with getting our images together, and again for hosting the physical exhibition. So Ken, this is, I'll say maybe one of your first work about what was once a ubiquitous presence, particularly in New York City, that was undone by a social technology. And just for the sake of the audience, we're going to pan in and out of the installation, sort of breaking it down by different elements. And then I really invite you to think of it as a holistic experience, as if you could experience it yourself, in three-dimensional real life. And please, gather the questions together and spend some time, more time with the work as you're able to. So, Ken, do you want to describe what we're looking at, just really simply, because we're going to go a little deeper into each of the components.
Yeah, so this is an installation view of the exhibition, the Medallion, and you're kind of standing, I guess, in the back of the gallery, looking towards in the direction of what there is typically a window, but it's been blocked out, and also the main entrance, the door to the right. And there's a two-channel video that is flanking the installation, and almost the entire floor of the gallery is covered in these beaded seat covers that have been tiled throughout. And there's about, I think, approximately 370 odd seat covers that cover most of the floor. And walking into the space, you are allowed to walk directly onto these seat covers to explore the sculptures that are all also resting on the ground. So the entire installation, all the objects, is floor based. And then yeah, the two channel video is flanking the installation itself.
Perfect. Thanks. I'll mention actually there is also a third video that we will discuss at the very, very far view here, which you can't see super clearly, but we'll get around to talking about that as well. Can we go to the next slide, Min? Great. So I realize this might seem like a mundane detail to focus on, but it actually does feature a medallion itself. And so I thought we would start here. We also have a second view that is a little bit more all-encompassing. But Ken, could we start here and actually ask? I wanted to ask you, how did you get interested in the culture of the medallion as an icon and what it represents? And if you want to refer to the short clip we saw in the introduction with the taxi cab driver himself, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, so there are actually two medallions in the show. It's a bit of an Easter egg where the second one is. But yeah, my interest came from a very mundane place of just reading, learning about it in a story, an investigative piece of investigative journalism in the New York Times. I think it was in 2018 or 2019, where a reporter was looking into the Medallion crisis, And the medallion, for those who are unfamiliar with it, is basically a kind of certificate. It's an object. It's a piece of metal that is stamped onto the hood of every licensed yellow cab in New York City, that allows the owner to operate a taxi, to own and operate their own taxi. But really, what it is a certificate, that or a license that allows for that ownership. And it's organized by the city. It's run by the Taxi and Livery Limousine Commission, TLC. And for a long time, the medallion, and it's also limited in quantity by the city. I forget how many exactly, maybe somewhere around 13,000. I'm not exactly sure about that number, but anyway, because it was limited in quantity, and it was the only way to own your own cab, it became a very valuable asset. And over time, this medallion, this asset, came to be worth close to $1 million. And it was very coveted because if you could purchase one of these, the understanding was that the value of this was only going to increase over time. It was like owning a piece of property, owning a home. It was something that you could retire off of. You could purchase this and ultimately have a kind of middle class life. And this was something that very much appealed to immigrants, and in fact was heavily marketed to them, because of again, it was a pathway towards a certain sort of economic status that had relatively few barriers to entry. And the crisis began when the value of these medallions started to plummet, partially due to the arrival of ride-hailing apps.
Why don't we
Um,
go to the next slide, Min? And yeah, Ken, you could just maybe continue on the sort of downfall and so I'm giving away actually where the second medallion is. This is a view, I believe, actually in your studio, Ken, or in the,
no,
because
this is in the
oh,
gallery.
it's in the
Yeah.
gallery
So,
before the floor was down. Yeah, maybe.
yeah. So you would not. So this piece, collision, does not look like this in the gallery because everything is on the beaded seat covers. But this is a kind of just single piece, single artwork kind of photo we took, and you can see the medallion tucked in there. Um, should I continue the
Sure, sure. No,
medallion
well, I think I'm interested
context?
as you started talking about the decline of ridership and how the medallion itself lost value. I was just really interested in this as a little portrait itself, and so wondered if you could speak to, um, yeah, of this particular. I don't even know if you call it, what do you call it? You call it a sculpture, right? A sculptural kind of like I call it a portrait, but what do you want? What would you? How would you speak about it?
Yeah, it's a sculpture. It has a title. It has a list of materials. And it's composed of you can read it there, but it's composed of found car parts, car debris, a medallion, some LED lights, battery powered LED lights, um, cast epoxy resin cast coffee lids, some glass pieces that actually came off of other glass objects in the installation, a gold retirement watch that I found off of eBay, and then some other kind of assorted objects in here. And in the installation, it's positioned in front of one of the projections, one of the one of the channels of the projections. And um, I think in the space, it feels, one of the things that it might refer to as a kind of roadside memorial, with the lights. Um, Suggesting some sort of violent event has taken place because of the car debris. And there's debris, and there's these kind of there's real car parts in the installation, but also reproductions of them. Um, and so, I think this piece um, can perhaps start to speak to the larger uh, ritualistic kind of connections I wanted to make, between the context of the medallion and the larger installation that I was creating, and really even using the medallion itself as a kind of connection point. The images that the word medallion conjures, um, between this sort of more certificate kind of legal context for the drivers, but also something perhaps more rooted in maybe the supernatural or the spiritual, right? A medallion, something that has a kind of otherworldly characteristics or something. So yeah, traversing these two kinds of worlds, and the installation perhaps is trying to bridge them.
Great, perfect. Thank you, Ken. I'll point out when we see a larger installation view of where this actually sits in the installation, as Ken mentioned, it's in front of one of the large two-channel videos. Let's go to the next slide, Min, please. So, okay, so it's actually in front of the other one, the other side. So I thought we could talk a little bit about the drivers themselves, Ken. I'll mention for our audience that the two channels of the video that you saw at the beginning run about 17 minutes or 16, 17 minutes. And Ken, as I understand it, it's from a larger film that you made that's around these interviews and around some of the staged performances that we're going to spend some time on as well. But could you tell us a little bit about like how you met these men? How do you sense they felt about working with you as an artist? And then was it any different working with this group than with your other groups that you've worked before?
Yes, so this two-channel video, also titled The Medallion, came from a film that I shot in 2023 that came out of a commission by this organization called All Arts that approached me to make something, anything I wanted really. And this project with the cab drivers have been kind of sitting in my back pocket for quite a while. And I never had the resources to really sort of make this film, this sort of experimental documentary, let's call it, about the driver. So when All Arts approached me, I was like, great, I have this project about the Medallion crisis that I want to produce. So that became a 30-minute-ish film, documentary-ish film called Driver Brother. And I met the drivers that you see in this in the Medallion and in Driver Brother through kind of a long process. It was difficult finding drivers that would be willing to participate in the video and in doing some of the activities I had planned. What my producer and I ultimately had to do, or the solution we found, was to actually go to the JFK taxi hold, which is a large parking area near JFK where cab drivers, yellow cab drivers, go and take their breaks, or when they're waiting for a fare at the airport. And it's a really large space. It's a kind of its own world, populated by drivers who are on break. And it's a kind of fascinating community to see in action. And once we met another driver who sort of like introduced us to this place, to kind of walked us in. He was a guy that claimed to know everyone when he didn't, but he kind of had this attitude where he would just go up to any random driver and say, "Hey, how are you doing?" Shake his hand. And that was the way in which we ultimately found the people that participated in the video. We literally were just knocking on windows and approaching drivers at random. And we found a group that was really open to trying something, quite different in terms of speaking about their experiences.
Fantastic. Thank you. I actually didn't know that you went to the taxi hold to find them. But I feel like, I didn't actually go to their place of social, break or anything, but I can remember leaving JFK and then the line of yellow taxi. I mean, they still have the taxi stand where you can get a ride. And, I feel like I could picture, the place where they would all gather before they lined up for a ride. Can we go to the next slide, Min? I think I have another view. Yeah. So this is then the other side of the sort of two-channel projection. They're presented kind of facing each other in the installation as opposed to side by side, which is how we were able to show it to you. So you can see here the collision sculpture that we introduced talking about the medallion about. I'm actually looking closer because it's hard to see, but tucked almost in the center of this piece, next to one of the brightest coffee cup lids, is a little red. Is it a necklace? No, it's something that hangs in the middle of the. Yeah, I mean, and that was in the description of the materials of the first view, but here you can actually see it. That again, I think kind of finishes the memorial in terms of its significance or some way. But could you describe that little addition?
Yeah, it's a car charm, something which is something that you would hang from your rear view mirror, and it's of a Guanyin uh, reproduction, which is kind of a Chinese goddess for bringing good luck. And yeah, it's just tucked in there. It's not very well lit. I think for most people, they would not even realize that object was there. But I think I included it because, I wanted to, so for this entire show, I was very careful about what I wanted to bring into this installation in terms of referencing the cab culture. I think there's so many cliches around cab driving that exist, especially the yellow cab in New York City. It's so iconic, and a lot of it is just kind of cheesy. And so for example, there's no there's no cab driver yellow anywhere in the installation. The only part of of an actual cab that exists in the show is the two-channel taxi video display that's on the other side of the gallery that you had mentioned earlier that I guess we'll talk about a little later. And then some of these kind of car charms, so the red Guanyin being one of them, and there's also a spinning Buddhist prayer wheel. And part of wanting to avoid, and I guess the seat covers too. I mean, they're not only specifically associated with cabs, but they're part of that world. And yeah, I wanted to avoid all of these kind of cliches, especially because the cab figures so much in within popular culture, but also in terms of so much marketing, some of the marketing that was often used to kind of create this the seduction of the medallion and entrapping, ensnaring a lot of these drivers in these debts to begin with. So yeah, I was very careful about what of that world I wanted to actually include, and I felt the car charm, this hanging object, spoke to one of the larger themes of the exhibition, which is of precarity and vulnerability, and the way that these things that hang in the cab drive in the cab itself are one of the few indications of perhaps where the driver is from, what sort of like cultural background these individuals are come from, but also they're good luck, they're tokens of good luck, and I felt like that says so much about how they feel in terms of their economic situation, that there's nothing secure. Even this medallion, which felt so rock solid as an investment, is now totally destabilized, and it's unclear what it means. In fact, it's probably more of a burden than anything else. So I don't know, these little tokens, these little objects, these trinkets that these drivers carry, I felt like they just kind of said so much, despite how small and perhaps even overlooked they might be.
Thank you so much, Ken. That's exactly what I was hoping. You could sort of encourage the viewer to sort of focus on details, and in their own way think about the people that were that this installation addresses. So let's go to the next slide. And so here I actually want to probe a little further, Ken, as you were saying, some of the more subtle, I guess, experiences of this culture around the medallion. We're going to end the program by watching another video that sort of finishes the two-channel run and focusing really on the three of the cab drivers who come together and perform. I mean, I call it a trio, as referring to it as a dance, loosely a dance kind of work. But I'd love to invite Ken to speak a little bit about your research process and especially around around the choreography of unscripted movement. And as a, I mean, in watching the video several times over, I'm always drawn to the moments um, where these very specific bodies um, reveal something else about themselves, and also the encounter between the trio in particular is incredibly intimate, but but in a way that's unfamiliar on some level, and I think again communicates something about the culture, but also about the burden that these bodies carry. So I would say throughout the exhibition, every element, whether it's the floor, whether it's the glass objects, whether it's some of the encaustic pieces that we're going to talk about, the sculptures, it's this notion of like um, of a resonant object, even in the bodies of the cab drivers, persists. So we can go to the next slide as well. So if you could just, yeah, so here's a little somewhat closer view um, of this section of the video with the three men. And I mean, again, uh, much of your work involves non-actors as cast and in somewhat staged performance. And I wonder if you could talk here about the process of working with these men, and also, um, you know, sort of maybe working with an outside choreographer, and sort of what prompted, how you're able to generate, I guess, movement from these bodies.
Yeah, so I guess one through line through a number of my more recent works is working with non-actors, non-professionals, and often having them do some kind of movement-based activity. Um, and part of that for me is seeing how these bodies move, thinking for this project, really thinking about how for these drivers, um, the act of driving, their job itself is incredibly physical. I mean, it may not feel that way. It might seem quite sort of sedentary and static, but there is a kind of intense pressure being placed on the body. It's more of a kind of control of the body, right? Like they seldom take breaks. They finding a bathroom is difficult. So it's a different kind of stress that these drivers have to kind of control or maintain as they're working. And they work long shifts, 10, 12 hours, 5, 6 days a week, maybe even more. And that's taxing. And that's something that came up quite a bit when I talked to them. And I wanted to 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 articulate that in some way in the show. And for me, using or working with non-actors and using movement is a way to explore a certain kind of vulnerability. Having these men use their bodies in ways that they are not used to at all, have no familiarity with, and seeing that, having the camera sort of pick that up, I find to always be incredibly moving. And it was a way for me to again explore this sense of certainly economic and social precarity, perhaps, but also a kind of physical one. Um, and so I worked with a choreographer, Kim Brandt, to just help me um, find the right sort of prompting to give to the drivers to allow that to happen. And so what you see in the video is entirely unscripted. I mean, there was a rehearsal process, and there was definitely some off-camera kind of work, but for the most part, the drivers came up with these movements themselves. I mean, it's all sort of improvised on the spot, and we give them very simple prompts to work with. But again, it was about seeing how these individuals who never use their bodies in this way can be expressive, and it's both beautiful but also kind of wrenching to see, I think.
Yeah, I really hope that For those of you who haven't seen Ken's work before, or haven't seen this piece, that you can spend some time with the actual video of not only this work, but maybe some of his previous work that we're going to see some stills of, but the time-based relationship between the, I'm going to call them the cast, because I think about it as a performance, but also the trust between them that gets expressed, as a group, and also their trust in Ken as the director, and the sort of like revelation that comes out through the camera is really remarkable. Can we go to the next slide? I think we're just going to get another view of, some of their posed movements, and then let's go to the next slide, which is another view of another kind of choreography, Ken, that you've added to your work in a performance video. And so it's a little faded here, but I think we're going to see we'll end with seeing it actually running through real time. But can you speak about maybe these sequences underwater? And I mean, I'm really fascinated how you gave any direction for this piece, and actually were you underwater with them? Were you the camera person in this incredible sequence that, I mean, on some level, it's an allegory to the experience of the cab drivers, as the debt being literally them feeling underwater, but it's incredibly evocative too. But yeah, could you speak about maybe the planning and actual production process of generating this content?
Yeah, so the footage that I generated with the drivers, there are three main sort of chunks. One was sort of more direct interview style footage. Another was the movement sequences, and a third took place underwater. And the water sequences, or underwater sequences, were really something I had wanted to do from the beginning. And for me, that space held a number of different kinds of meanings. Certainly, the metaphor of being underwater is a way to describe um, being so indebted that your asset is worth less than the loan that you took out to pay for it. That was something that was on top of mind. But also as part of my research into the Medallion crisis, um, I learned that, and this is actually what started to generate more public attention towards this, was that a number of drivers had started to commit suicide as a way to kind of escape their loans. And there was one driver who had died by, drowning in the East River. So the water itself, became a kind of more really kind of charged and heavy space linked to death in that way. But at the same time, I was trying to think of a situation where the body could also be kind of free to be liberated from the sort of like the straitjacket of the cab, and I felt like a water environment could perhaps suggest that too. I've had a number of people who see the video, these scenes, and think like, oh, are they? It makes them think of like a kind of a healing bath or something like that. So I'd like the sort of the tension between the water as something associated with death, associated with a kind of a drowning, both metaphorical and literal, but also as a space that could be potentially healing or liberatory. And so in this installation, I think those scenes function in both those ways simultaneously. Um, in terms of the production of it, I was not underwater. Fortunately, I had to hire a specialized crew to do to do these scenes. We rented a diving pool in New Jersey and spent the day there. The drivers, some not all of whom were entirely comfortable being underwater. Um, we had safety divers. We were very well prepared in that regard. We spent the day recording them jumping in and out of the water, treading water, trying to perform very simple exercises in that pool. And they were, such good sports about it. It was difficult because they're all wearing their clothes. Part of it was that they'd be wearing, their sort of their driving clothes, shoes, sneakers, etc., so that it looked a bit more surreal, right? There was not just like some casual dip in the pool, but so to suggest these other things. And so yeah, so it was always a really crucial part of the video of the larger project, having these surreal underwater scenes where the body is both kind of struggling, but also in a very sort of placid state, right? Like when they're floating. There's a really beautiful scene where Bilal, one of the drivers, is just kind of floating, and you see his reflection on the surface of the water. So it's almost like he's floating into himself simultaneously, yeah, it's a really beautiful but haunting image.
Thank you so much, Ken, for opening that up a little bit. I mean, I absolutely agree that the underwater footage opens up a whole other world and experience, as minimal as it is. I mean, in this image, actually, I'm also really taken by the lighting, which your reference to the scene of the man floating also has this incredible sense of, is it a transformation? Is it you know is it a change of, like, dark, from dark to light, so these states of in-betweenness are incredibly evocative in the underwater footage. um
Yeah, it's a limbo space, which I think, something that I think could be said of the entire installation, right? They're caught in between these moments, and they're stuck. They're really, really stuck.
um so I thought what we could do for maybe the next 10 minutes or so is actually look at some of Ken's previous work, because I do think that the themes around, particularly the immigrant experience, around this culture, a certain male culture, and the ways in which Ken's work, I think, goes underneath the stereotype while looking, at the sort of their own rituals, is carried through several, I'm going to say, like, mid-career, high, very mature performance videos. And then we'll go back to the Medallion installation, kind of finish and sort of looking at the sculptures and looking at the final video piece. So this still is, I mean, I would, of course, invite Ken to speak about it, but this was actually the first of Ken's work that I saw myself. And interestingly enough, it was a live performance for an online audience only. So there was already a sense of disembodiment for the viewer, and look at this very strange, um, performance work. And if I understand correctly, you did this piece, and the next piece we're going to look. Well, we're actually going to skip over. Well, anyway, there were three back-to-back works. This piece, Silent Spikes, which we'll spend some time on, and then Founding of the World. But so 1 and 3, let's say, The Crossing and Founding of the World, had a specific research content that you were looking at, and then Silent Spikes was another historical topic. But yeah, so I'm wondering maybe if you want to talk about, again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on these earlier works, but that preceded the Medallion. But yeah, quickly, sort of like, what was the sort of, like, I mean, the invitation to do a live performance, even though it was online. I'm very curious about your interest in that.
Yeah, so gosh, there's a lot of context, but this actually came from a residency uh, that the curator at the time, Lumi Tan, had invited me to participate in, that the kitchen was organizing in an offsite space. And we did not know that the world would be going into lockdown, into kind of a virtual mode when that invitation happened. So I had a live performance I wanted to produce in mind, and it, for better or worse, became a live stream performance. And the content of this performance it stemmed from my research and interest in the kinds of rituals of certain Asian American fraternities. And basically, I had uh, learned about through the New York Times again. It's where I get all my ideas from. But another sort of piece of investigative journalism looking into the death of a young college student at the hands of his fraternity brothers through hazing. And in that story, it sort of details this whole kind of more or less hidden world of these fraternities, and the kinds of rituals that they perform, often in private, that speak to ideas about, let's say, diasporic longing, certainly a performance of masculinity, but also the ways in which violence becomes ritualized and the ways in which violence and intimacy are intertwined. And I was really fascinated by how performance in the body becomes the site for all these things and the various kinds of competing forces that were at work. So I worked, um, yeah, I wanted to make that into a kind of a real physical experience that became the crossing, which is the still you see here.
And we can
And
go to the next one, actually, just another view of it.
yeah, and so it's hard to describe just in stills, but it was a three-act performance that took from a lot of different material that I was discovering on YouTube that these fraternities would actually produce and put out there as kind of like marketing almost. And there are these things called the probate, which are these public performances that they put on as a kind of final step in the initiation process. I was really interested in the ritual and the way that like this particular ritual marked a kind of movement from being a kind of from from being outside the fraternity and then being accepted as a full-fledged member and what that transition entailed, the loss of an individual identity for the sake of a group identity, and again, the role of violence, physical violence, in that transition. And so this three-act performance was an attempt to kind of use movement to basically dramatize that transition with
Thank you
four
so
actual performers. So these were not non-performers, these were actual. The first time I worked with professionals, let's say, yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Ken. So I want the audience to maybe hang on to Ken's description of like competing forces within a single body, and particularly the body of an Asian man. I want to maybe trace that body through these works. Can we go to the next slide? We're going to go back to Ken's work with Asian American fraternities, but this piece, which was actually, I did see the show in person that was at the Queen's Museum. So, kind of back to back, 2020, 2021, two different bodies of work. And this is a still from another two-channel video work that Ken did that I'm going to invite him to speak about a little bit. But it's a piece that actually the Brooklyn Rail reviewed in 2021, and it traveled fairly widely to Marfa, Texas, and to Boston. And again, there's so much richness to this particular installation as well. But again, maybe focusing on the body of this representation of a man, I guess. So Ken, do you want to, again, briefly maybe give the research behind silent spikes, and then we can talk a little bit more about, I have some views of this body, and it's, whenever I watch this piece, I always am amazed at the forms that it takes, the form of the Asian cowboy, the form of this, the lassoing of an imaginary horse, the bucking bronco. I mean, just there's just so much force being put on it. This notion of competing forces, and but at the same time, as in the crossing, this body wanting to find belonging, and then in this series, your attempt at proposing a new body that history actually has never seen before. But anyway, let's go back to the history you were delving into, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, so Science Bikes is another two-channel video that I made that really was a product of the pandemic. Production had started before and had finished during. And yeah, this project was an attempt to synthesize a bunch of different things. It's not just necessarily a research project, though there was definitely a research component. specifically the history of migrant labor, the Chinese migrant labor that helped build the transcontinental railroad in the 1800s. But there was also an exploration of what Asian American masculinity might even look like, not as a kind of like defined thing, but as a question, as a kind of amorphous moving target, let's say. And the image of the cowboy, the cliched image of the cowboy became like kind of one anchor that I was using to kind of play with, really, right? Like trying to use again, I'm sure there were Asian, I mean I know there were Asian cowboys, Chinese cowboys in history, but it's not an actual historical figure that I was referencing. It was more like an imaginary one, as you said. And the video is quite playful. There's a lot of movement that gets used in there. Again, these are non-actors, non-professionals that I found, a group of individuals who did not know each other before, but were sort of assembled in this sort of motley crew. And most of the footage of this video is them performing in various ways or in response to various prompts, again, unscripted and usually improvised. There's also some talking head parts where they're responding to direct questions that I'm asking them, but it's
We can
all
go to the next
edited.
slide, actually.
Excuse me.
But we can go to the next slide here. This
Oh
maybe is the
yeah.
good way to, to
And
continue
that
your, yeah.
footage, all that preceding footage is also intercut with this very dramatic shot, tracking shot, uncut tracking shot going into one of these tunnels, one of the actual tunnels that was hand excavated by these migrant laborers. And yeah, it's an attempt to speak about a lot of these themes, but not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have a thesis. Using history as a way to kind of like ask questions about the present and certainly about identity, and belonging and loss. Um, yeah, and I don't know how else to. It's this is a piece that's always I find difficult to enter into because there's so many ways to enter. There's so many, like the tunnel being a great kind of metaphor for that. Um, but the destination is not really the goal. It was about sort of bringing together all these different layers of material. And the format of video is so excellent for that. It is one that encourages collaging and layering. And yeah, it is. I don't know. I'm not sure what else I can say. I mean,
You know,
there
I
is
think
research, but the
actually,
research only goes so far.
yeah, no, I think actually that's a good place to maybe keep looking at through lines in, sort of like this like half 5 years worth of work. Can we go to the next slide? I think I have one more of, yeah. So this is another view. And again, seeing this in stills is not the same as through time because you really get to see um, the two channels talking to each other, but then also these, men kind of like being instructed to like reperform a kind of strange ritual, and also, as these kind of fabulous embodiments. Um, I have a question that might take us down a different alleyway, and I want to be conscious of time as I want to get back to the medallion. So maybe I'll hold my question, and we'll just keep working through the works here, and hopefully maybe the audience might have some pathways that they want to go down. I guess I mean I'm going to ask my question, but I don't want you to answer it. I'm just going to leave it out there as a question because I want to actually go to another work. But actually, and the question I actually you mentioned this not being like a super deep research project, but I am interested in like your own thinking. As a student of art and as an educator now yourself, like what artists you were looking at in thinking about, creating a new visual language around these men and these histories. And so because I'm struck that like you don't often see an Asian male body in contemporary art or in video. And so, the images I'm thinking of are like a Tetching Shea performance, which is, him in a very straight kind of embodiment as himself, or a Sen Quan Chi, image of an artist in a Mao suit, but like in innocuous setting like Disneyland or the Grand Canyon, but those are very particular kind of almost stereotypes. And so, really, I feel like I am curious, who you were looking at in terms of thinking about your own, aesthetic language. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to go back to then. So this piece is the piece that immediately preceded the medallion, and it returns to some of these processes now that we're seeing that you've working in terms of like working with a cast, creating these performance sequences. Again, I'm super interested in the solo body, and how it gets reshaped in your work. And then we'll talk a little bit about the sculptures as well. But is there anything you maybe want to share with us about the continuation of how this work maybe relates to the crossing?
Yeah, this is an installation version, I guess, of sorry, I'm gonna cough for a second here.
And we can go to the next slide while he's coughing. Another view of it.
This is an installation that continues my interest in the rituals of these fraternities, these Asian American fraternities. And there's a single channel video with these objects flanking it. And this video is so we're seeing right now is a dancer, an actual professional dancer who is a member of Bill T. Jones' company, actually, Hui Wang Zhang. And it features him, but also a group of again, non-professionals. And it's another kind of attempt to speak to the way that the body is used to negotiate these kind of forces that I had mentioned before of wanting to belong, of assimilation, but also the way in which violence becomes the kind of I don't know, the glue that brings people together. Like, in order to get to the intimacy, one must brutalize each other. And one of the things I talk about is how that actually has perhaps nothing to do with Asian American identity. It speaks much more about an American identity, right? Like an American or just Western sort of expectation of the male body, of the sort of the at least the male body within a homosocial context, like how specifically young men are expected to engage with one another. What are the sort of the codes and practices associated with belonging? And so this video attempts to further those ideas. It's partially a recreation, a loose recreation, let's say, of some of the source material I was seeing on YouTube of these fraternities performing the probate. But it's also partly imagined. And then Hui Wang, the solo performer, he shows up as a kind of phantom figure. It's not clear who he is within this world, but his movement is so intense and physical. He's a trained dancer, so he brings a different level of physicality, of bodily rigor into it, which is really I found like it was so satisfying to kind of watch him move, because he was just so good at it. And then the objects in the room, they speak to also ideas about ritual and the way in which certain kinds of fluids, let's say, are associated with moments of transition or of adolescence. So certainly the empty alcohol bottle, kind of a clear way in which that fits into the worlds of fraternity culture. But then also these bottles of cologne, these very like popular colognes that were, at least when I was growing up, marketed towards young men, and how like the scent becomes associated with a certain kind of body in maybe not in transition, but certainly like a body that is evolving. But also trying to sort of suggest something more violent with these objects. So they're hanging from these dark pipes, and there are these flashlights, these tactical flashlights that are sort of illuminating them from below. So yeah,
Can you
trying
go
to
to the next
collapse the
slide?
world,
Yeah.
just trying to collapse ideas about ritual and violence again, and notions of belonging.
So here's a view, an additional view from the same video installation. And as Ken was mentioning, the group work with some of the non-professional dancers. And can we go to the next slide? Min, the next slide, please. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Let's go back to the single. Yeah, so here, as Ken was describing, the single dancer wearing the sort of, the mask, and a stilled moment of him going through these embodied rituals. And let's end with this next one of close-up of the sculptures themselves. I'm hoping that you'll remember this image and Ken's kind of interest in the shape of the bottle and the shape of like fluids and how they operate within a kind of technology of desire and technology of belonging and wanting to identify with a certain kind of image of masculinity. Can we go to the next slide? I think there's and also so again for the very, very perceptive, Ken mentioned certain details also within these installations, which again I feel like culminates in the medallion. But there's a very intentionally placed knife in the video screen of this installation. And so maybe we could just have you speak a little bit about, again, the I guess the purpose and the meaning of this object.
Yeah, it's a butterfly knife, or I think it's called a balisong. I'm mispronouncing that, but anyway, it's an object that doesn't have any particular role within the material of that I was researching about fraternity culture, but somehow I came across this object because, again, it's this very violent act of stabbing the projection screen, but also these butterfly knives. I remember when I was in high school, I had friends who would have these things and they would love to perform with them. There was this whole thing about like tricks and learning how to flip the knife open, and my friends would be cutting their fingers open trying to perform the thing. So I like the way in which like the knife actually became a kind of like performance object and had a certain kind of flamboyance to it. So it wasn't just something that was aggressive, but it was actually kind of it had a kind of performative element built into it. And I wanted to include the knife somewhere in the show. So this is an actual real knife that's embedded in the projection screen, and then there are some sculptures in another gallery that we didn't look at. There are some trainer knives, they're actually called, where the blade isn't sharp, but it's just meant for practicing these tricks on, so you don't cut yourself. And they're plated this really cheesy gold. So I don't know, there's something so evocative about those objects for me, perhaps just relating to the things that I remember from my own adolescence.
We can go to the next two slides quickly, Min. So
Oh, there
here
we go.
are
Okay.
the knives, yeah, and then and let's stop here quickly. And I want to make a transition from the videos and the objects to these sculptural pieces, Ken, and as we return to the medallion. And I guess what I'm struck by. I'd love to have you describe this work, but really, for me, the memory of the body actually in these sculptures and in this body of work and in the body of work from the medallion really resonated. So could you just talk about this quickly, and then we'll return to the medallion and wrap
Yeah,
it
these
up.
are these wall leaning sculptures made out of aqua resin, so they're not actually textile, but they're cast facsimiles of that. And it's what you're seeing is a kind of what looks like a pile of hoodies, maybe like 7 or 10. I don't exactly remember the number, that are kind of scattered and layered on top of one another in this slightly haphazard kind of way. And embedded in the sculpture are various metal objects, including, I'm just going to read this from the side here, imitation gold chains, safety razor blades, utility knife blades, metal watch bands, chrome dog tags, dog tag holders, handcuff keys, Chinese charm coins. And so this amalgamation of hoodies definitely suggests a group of bodies. But I didn't want to, or I wanted to confused, perhaps, like, is this a kind of are these bodies coming together in a kind of violent way, or is there something more intimate happening? An image that was really present in my mind was thinking about like going to a party and how everyone just tosses their coats onto a bed or on the floor, and at the end of the night, you have this massive pile of clothing, and that's one of the things I wanted to evoke. But also something again, this sort of like phantom, perhaps, this menacing, lurking presence that is both amorphous but also very much rooted in a collection in a collective of bodies, specifically male identifying bodies. And embedded in it again are these kinds of tokens that I associate with a certain kind of adolescence, whether it be the metal watch band or dog tags, heavy chains were in when I was in high school. But then, of course, something again more sinister, like these razor blades, handcuff keys, etc.
Great, Ken, thank you so much. Let's see, I think the next slide, we're returning now to the medallion. All right, great. So I wanted to begin to conclude by focusing on these new sculptural elements in the medallion. So Ken, here we have the floor itself again, which I think you already spoke about. And I wanted to let the audience know that the title of the floor actually has its own title, which is 370,000 recitations. So I think Ken mentioned that there were 370 body rest. So I guess there's like must be 1,000 or 10,000 beads in one of them, or 1,000 beads in one of them. So again, this like reference to ritual, in the floor. But Ken, this cast glass piece, which is hard to see with the lighting underneath it, what it is something I'd love to have you talk about, and then we'll kind of take the large view of the installation again to wrap it up for the audience.
Yeah, so the cast glass works are reproductions of coolant reservoirs that you would find in a car, not specifically a cab, but just any kind of vehicle. And there are two of these in the show. And one thing that I was thinking about, I guess I might have already mentioned, was just the presence of fluids and the control of the body. These drivers cannot use the bathroom, and they find, there are, they find ways to kind of relieve themselves. But also like it becomes another kind of oppressive um, element in their lives. And I wanted to sort of evoke those fluids, but also a kind of more ritualistic kind of vessel. Again, bridging the space between, the working in the cab and something more otherworldly, perhaps. And so these reservoirs became the kind of they kind of straddled those two spaces for me. And so I had them cast in glass again as a way of evoking or emphasizing a kind of ritualistic quality to them. And they're placed on the ground on these illuminated beads composed of 3D printed material with LEDs in them.
Great, thank you. Can we go to the next slide, Min? So throughout the installation, as Ken mentioned, there are these additional sculptures of backpacks that have been kind of frozen in a kind of encaustic, and then with these, with these inserts in them. Can we look at the next slide? So these are views of them sort of before the floor has been placed. And another one, the next one. Maybe I'm so tempted to stay here because of the shoe and the
Let's stay with the shoe.
Okay, let's and the could just like, yeah, Ken, could you maybe talk a little bit about what you were trying to evoke here in the shoe and the backpack? Again, thinking about the collision, thinking about the strewn car parts and the sort of violence of the profession itself.
Yeah, I mean, I just made a connection that I had not really made before, and this is Robert Gober and his shoes and his facsimiles of objects, and certainly, we're dealing with different ideas about the body, specific to the male body, but there's definitely a kind of overlap. especially with mold making, he's so associated with reproductions of everyday objects. Now the shoe here is an actual shoe. It's not I didn't make it. It's found. But the reason why I decided to bring in a shoe at all was because I was thinking again about the floor, the beaded floor as a kind of ritual space that might evoke ideas of being perhaps in a religious space like a mosque or a temple or anywhere where the floor itself becomes active. Your body, you're placing yourself in the body already places you in a space that is not the profane world. You are entering a kind of sacred space. And when that happens, you acknowledge that by taking off your shoes. And oftentimes there's like if you go into one of these spaces, there's a place where you put your shoes. Maybe it's like a giant pile or it's more organized. So the shoe for me became a way of like defiling the space. Became a way of applying some, provoking the space in some way. I mean, you as a viewer are already walking into the space and applying pressure to these beads, and that's one sort of provocation. And I thought the shoe itself, or at least just having a shoe somewhere, might lend someone to thinking about again the space as a kind of semi-sacred place, and our presence being a defiling of that in some way. Um, so yeah, so the shoe is here, and then there's this bag cast in aqua resin, kind of surrounding it. And the other bags that are in the show are all cast in aqua resin as well.
We could go to the next slide. And I think, yeah, so this idea of like being prone, it's an installation that really is a very horizontal one and, pulls the body down and um, pulls the spectacle kind of like to this other space. So you see here another view of one of the backpacks with broken car parts and then one of the cast glass fluid containers. I don't think we have a lot of time actually to talk about the final two-channel video. Can we go to the next slide? But I actually do want to encourage anyone who has a chance to go and see the show, to see this two-channel piece. I will let Ken talk about it for a minute because I think it's such a, evocative, different kind of video that I've not seen in his work before. But I also do want to end on some other little like quiet rewards that the not quiet but actually surprises that the installation offers. Anyway, Ken, quickly, maybe something about this video here.
Yeah, so this video, it's actually really like a video sculpture plays on a display that you would actually see on the tops of taxi cabs. These two-channel video displays that are typically displaying ads, Wicked, whatever's playing on Broadway, things like that. And in here, it's filled with a continuous stream of images from my own personal archive from my phone through the years, from the past decade roughly. And I pushed it through this kind of cheesy AI filter where the AI the program will detect what it thinks is a body and then dissolve it in this sort of like violent spray of particles of dust. So it's like if you've seen the Avengers movie, like everyone gets dusted. This is kind of like a version of that, I guess. And yeah, it's basically this endless stream of images of people in my life sort of being vaporized. And I wanted some way to sort of, reference myself in a kind of flat-footed way. I didn't want to use images of the drivers. I felt like I had already incorporated their presence, their physical images enough in the gallery, and I didn't want to implicate them in another way. And it felt right to kind of implicate myself. Like I think, people always ask me like, oh, so where are you in the video? How are you directing? How are you, staging these things? And this is perhaps one way of trying to answer the where am I in this installation. And it's a kind of it's a difficult piece. It feels very different from everything else and everything else I've done before, I think. Um, Seeing one's sort of loved ones or friends just sort of like disappearing. And I think certainly it's meant to sort of evoke another kind of loss. Um, but one using technology and the way in which, things like AI are as a stand-in for these larger kind of structures that are maybe not literally eviscerating the body, but certainly putting pressures on it. So that's kind of what I was thinking about when producing this thing. And though it is a two-channel, both sides are displaying the same video.
Yeah, I wonder maybe if this is going to lead to another body of work as you start talking about the way in which, automated technology is changing the body and changing the ways in which we are seeing ourselves. So let's finish, Min, if we could go to the last two slides. Again, I wanted to sort of let viewers know that some of the beaded floor coverings actually also have other video or other visual images in them. This one is particularly called, I think the name of the sculpture is Anxiety Clock. And then here's another view of it, before the other pieces were added. And then the last image, I wanted to leave us with this image because, as Ken referred to it earlier, it's a reference to the drivers themselves and also to, in some way, the rhythm of the entire installation, sort of um, between dissolution and between dispersal and between life and death. And so, I mean, in the installation, the prayer wheel actually is moving itself. And I like that it's a Buddhist, ritual, and that it sort of brings us back into the lives of these men. We are going to, I think, soon invite the audience for their questions. But Ken, do you want to offer any final thoughts here on as we complete the discussion of the medallion? And if we actually have time, we will show at the ending couple of minutes of the two-channel video itself after the questions. But Ken, any final thoughts on the medallion? And thank you to the audience for sticking with us for this hour that's gone by so fast.
Yeah, I can say just one or two things about the prayer wheel. So those who are unfamiliar with this, it's a small dashboard top item that is solar powered, and it spins. And the idea is that within this object is an actual mantra, like a written long piece of paper with a mantra written on it over and over again that's tucked inside. And the spinning of the wheel represents the sort of recitation of the mantra. And while I include it in the show because, I'm directly referencing the sort of the cultural background of some of the drivers, but this idea of the spinning, this thing that continually moves, and the mantra, this thing that gets recited over and over again, I think has an interesting, if not perhaps devastating corollary in the way in which these drivers, all they can think about is this debt. When you hear some of them talk about it, it is this thing. It becomes their mantra, right? This number, how much they owe, how long they've owed it for, and how long they had to repay it back for. The spiritual has been replaced by the sort of the burdens of capitalism, the cruelty of numbers. And so even this thing, which seems so precious and evocative and earnest, also has a kind of cruel edge to it. And I think that for me is something that I feel like I wanted to sort of evoke throughout the show, the just how fucked up this situation is for them, and the ways in which we might become implicated in this. So yeah, I don't know. It's a lot for a little object, but it, I don't know. These small things really sort of I don't know. They feel so meaningful for me because of that. Like the way in which this is the only thing in which they'll put in their cab that even speaks to like where they're from or any sort of information about themselves as people. And because of that, it has to do so much.
Yeah, I agree that somehow this piece, when I saw it, captured for me the the unending cycle of the lives of these drivers, but then also, is there yet another like little layer of a way out or something, mentally, not necessarily in terms of the debt itself. Min, I think I'm going to hand it back to you and to wrap us up, or Chloe or Magdalene, any of the Rail, our wonderful Rail hosts.
Thank you so much, Ken and Christina. That was wonderful. We have so many thoughtful questions from the audience. Thank you for sending us questions. You've talked about this a bit today, but If there's anything you want to add, Ken. Maddie Davis sent us a question. I love the performance aspect of the video work. The drivers feel so vulnerable and present. How did you approach the cab drivers in a conversation about dance? I imagine that doing something like that is far from their daily experience. How did you guide them through movement and the development of movement vocabulary and talk with them about what exactly they are performing and its meaning?
Yeah, great question. So I worked with choreographer artist Kim Brandt, who helped kind of mediate a lot of these, a lot of the vocabulary, I guess, around movement. I will say that I don't think I even ever used the D word dance. Like that was not how I framed these activities, and nor was that how I conceptualized it. It's really about movement, and you know, so much of the movement in all of my work is really trying to visualize the ways in which we are alienated from our own bodies. I think that's really what I hope to capture, and maybe that's what the questioner is responding to in terms of the vulnerability, or at least that's definitely how I respond to it. Like seeing how these individuals are moving their body for the first time, and realizing that like, oh, you've never like explored that aspect of your own body before, right? Like the thing that is most intimate and close to you is simultaneously estranged from you. And I think partially that is due to things like capitalism and the way that, the jobs of the cab drivers alienates them from themselves. And so part of what I'm trying to do in these movement sequences is to show that sort of distance, but then to also see how they respond when they are finding pleasure in movement. One of the drivers, Bilal, afterwards, we kind of like talk about like, oh, how was this? How was that for you? And he talked about how satisfying it was to be able to do that with his body, and he derived great pleasure from just these abstract things that he didn't really know what he was doing, but was so sort of satisfying for him. And that wasn't the goal necessarily, but I thought it did say so much about, again, like how these bodies are so foreign to them in some way.
Thank you, Ken. Our next question is from John. I'm struck by the similarities between Ken's work and the work of Terry Atkins and how Atkins would organize his work into recitals. I'm wondering in his research and preparation process how Ken thinks of how he divides or shares his themes and ideas between performance, sculpture, objects, video, etc. Thank you.
Um, well, I love the Terry Atkins reference. I'm familiar with some of his work, but was not someone that I was necessarily referencing. But in terms of how I negotiate all these things, I mean, it's I don't know, it's a complicated sort of constellation of things that really only I can only sort of understand in the exhibition, I guess. I don't know. I think I'm at this point where I'm interested in layering things. It's not just about making a body of sculpture. It's not just about performance or one video, but seeing how these things sort of come together and complicate each other and may perhaps even contradict each other. I should say that I have no background in movement. I have no background in film or video. These were not things I was trained in. I went to art school, but I didn't, have a proper sort of education in any of these things. So I come to them as purely as a fan and as a dilettante. And I think that's what excites me about them. And I think I try to use these things as yeah, as different kinds of material, and in a way to kind of create a more sort of textured understanding of the stuff I'm interested in.
Our next question is from an anonymous member of the audience. The work looks great. I have two prolonged questions. Is this work therapeutic or A, therapeutic for the drivers? B, is the work aiming to create awareness of the medallion crisis in the viewer?
Um, I mean, the last question, yes. I mean, I definitely hope that folks who encounter this exhibition will learn more about this crisis, which is ongoing. It's not This has not resolved itself by any means. There has been some debt relief due to activism on the part of the drivers. And I should say that a number of the drivers that I worked with and that I encountered are very active in the protests, in the larger sort of cabbie union organizing that has been ongoing. So they're very aware of both their sort of political um, strengths and their visibility that they have. And that's part of why they were even interested in participating in this, because for them, I think it offered another way of getting their story out. So yeah, again, I hope that there is some sort of learning going on as part of encountering this exhibit. But I'm not an activist. My relationship to this material is also as a kind of outsider. So I can't claim any of the sort of the real hard work that a lot of these drivers have done in terms of advocating for their own cause. And in terms of therapy, I mean, I think some of the drivers did see it that way, but that wasn't necessarily my goal. I'm to be honest, I'm kind of dubious about therapy. Like, I don't know if I want, this is a polemical thing to say, but like, I don't know if I want my art to heal, to be honest. I think I'm much more drawn to, that knife in the side, like that is the thing that I find myself really, I don't know. That's the kind of emotional, psychological space that I want art to kind of put me into. So if anyone is this feel a kind of therapeutic healing, have that kind of response in the work, that's great, but that's not necessarily how I come to it.
Thank you. And our last question is from Asif. Thank you for the wonderful exchange. I really appreciate how you work directly with the site of behavior, memory, trauma, violence, body, etc. These seem like emotional or personal resurrection of the actual situations. What sort of framework or decision making steers this zone of recreation?
Hey, Asif. Can you repeat that last part of the question again?
Yeah, sure. Um, what sort of framework or decision making steers the zone of recreation?
That's interesting. I mean, I think I'm always sort of I think the subject matter that I get most drawn to is one where it seems like I'm drawn to tragedy, but that's not really it. It's more about the sort of instances where again this sort of analogy of like forces, things that are being pressure that is being applied to physical bodies and the ways in which individuals negotiate those pressures. And I think I try to construct frameworks that bring those pressures perhaps to the surface in some way. Not necessarily in a violent way, but in a way that perhaps produces feelings of empathy on the viewer's part, um, but also a kind of I don't know, leaves you sort of unsettled or yeah, feeling wounded. Maybe that's the feeling of being wounded as a kind of framework, if that makes sense. Um, and I think that's also, I haven't really talked about this that much, but I think it's very much located in sort of diasporic identity and diasporic longing. I grew up in Queens and from parents that were immigrants, and I think that sort of wounding is always there in some way. I don't know. So that's another kind of through line in some of the subject matter that I'm drawn to. Um, Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that answers what you're asking for, Asif.
Thank you, Ken. Um, just checking, would you like to watch the last bit of the medallion? Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen again.
Yeah, I think that would be great, Min. Maybe, and I'll just comment that, Ken, one of the questions I actually wanted to ask earlier is actually what it meant for you to present this work in New York City at this time. And I think you already kind of answered it with this, over hour long delve into your sources and your decision making and your process. I guess I'll just say that, like, for me, encountering, I mean, I know I'm encountering actually a great work of art when I'm actually left with more questions, which is what, going to see this installation does for me. I just want to go further and further into the kind of insights that you've raised. So should we just watch this end video? And I just want to say thank you so much to the audience and to the Rail and to you, Ken, for taking time out of your day to be with us and to be with this work.
Oh, thank you, everyone.
Man, I don't think the sound is playing again.
It might be just really quiet.
Yeah, I think it's pretty quiet here. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Ken and Christina, for such a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Bridget and Tony from Bridget Donahue for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. The donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operation. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Saya Woolfolk and Eleanor Hartney on the occasion of the Woods Woman Method at Susan Inglet Gallery. You can now, and as it is a Rail tradition, you can now turn on your mic and say goodbye as you leave.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Kenneth and Christina.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
Great job.
Take care,
Everybody,
everyone.
take care.